The fastest way to discover how much someone respects you is to watch what they are willing to laugh about when a room is full of people. That sentence did not mean much to me until the night my own husband smiled, picked up a microphone, and turned me into the punchline of an event that was supposed to celebrate generosity instead of humiliation. My name is Emily Carter, and my husband, Daniel Carter, had convinced me to attend a charity fundraiser hosted by one of his company's longtime business partners. The ballroom looked beautiful, filled with round tables dressed in white linens, warm lights reflecting across polished wood floors, and hundreds of guests enjoying dinner while local organizations shared stories about helping families in need. Daniel had been excited about the event for weeks. He told me it would be good networking, good food, and a chance to spend an elegant evening together after several busy months. I believed him. I even bought a new navy blue dress because he once told me that color always made me smile. Throughout dinner everything felt perfectly normal. We laughed with another couple at our table, applauded the student musicians performing near the stage, and donated to the evening's silent auction. Daniel seemed relaxed, joking with coworkers the way he always did. Looking back, there was nothing that warned me the evening was about to change. After dessert, the Master of Ceremonies announced a series of light-hearted fundraising games where volunteers could participate for entertainment while encouraging additional donations. The audience applauded enthusiastically as several guests joined the stage for harmless competitions. Daniel leaned toward me with the grin I had known since college and whispered, "This is going to be fun." Before I could ask what he meant, he raised his hand. A volunteer hurried over with a microphone, assuming Daniel wanted to pledge another donation. Instead, he laughed and said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "I have an item for the auction tonight. Anyone interested in borrowing my wife for household chores? She makes the best cookies in town." Several people chuckled politely, believing it was nothing more than playful humor between a married couple. I forced a small smile because I assumed the joke would end there. It did not. Daniel continued with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Come on, somebody has to start the bidding. $20. That is all I am asking." More laughter rippled through the ballroom. Someone jokingly raised a hand. Another guest called out, "$25. The Master of Ceremonies looked uncertain, unsure whether to stop the exchange or let it pass as harmless comedy. My face grew warm as every pair of eyes seemed to drift toward me. I was no longer sitting beside my husband as his partner. I had become part of the entertainment. Daniel laughed even harder, completely unaware that every joke felt heavier than the one before it. He thought he was creating a memorable moment. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded tightly in my lap beneath the tablecloth, hoping the laughter would disappear as quickly as it had begun. Instead, another playful voice called out from across the ballroom, $30. The room erupted again. I looked down at the untouched glass of water in front of me because it suddenly felt easier than looking at the hundreds of smiling faces around us. In that moment, the amount of money did not matter. Whether the number was $20 or $2,000, the feeling was exactly the same. My dignity had somehow become a game. And what hurt even more was realizing the person leading the laughter was the man who had once promised to spend his life protecting my heart. Then, just as another joke was about to be made, I noticed someone at the back of the ballroom slowly rise from his chair, and unlike everyone else in the room, he was not smiling. For several long seconds the ballroom remained caught somewhere between laughter and confusion. The man who had stood up at the back of the room did not raise his voice or rush toward the stage. He simply adjusted his suit jacket, placed his dinner napkin on the table, and walked calmly down the center aisle. Every step seemed to quiet another conversation until the only sound left was the soft echo of his dress shoes across the polished floor. I had never seen him before. He appeared to be in his early 50s, with silver beginning to show around his temples and the kind of steady expression that made people instinctively stop talking when he entered a room. Daniel Carter noticed him approaching and laughed awkwardly into the microphone. "Looks like we finally have a serious bidder," he joked, hoping to keep the playful mood alive. A few scattered chuckles followed, but they were noticeably weaker than before. The stranger accepted the microphone only after the master of ceremonies silently offered it to him. He looked first at Daniel, then at me, before slowly turning toward the audience. "May I ask one question?" he said politely. His voice was calm enough that nobody felt challenged, yet confident enough that every guest leaned forward to listen. Daniel shrugged with a smile. "Sure. Go ahead." The stranger nodded once. "If someone stood on this stage and joked about auctioning their best friend for $20, would everyone still be laughing?" The room became noticeably quieter. Nobody answered. He continued just as gently. "What about a daughter? A mother? A sister?" Several guests lowered their eyes toward their tables. Someone near the front quietly set down a fork that had been tapping against a plate only moments earlier. Daniel attempted another smile. "It is only a joke," he said. "Emily knows I would never actually mean it." The stranger looked at him without anger. "I believe you," he replied. "But the question is not whether you meant it. The question is whether the person beside you felt honored or embarrassed while everyone else was laughing." Those words settled over the ballroom far more heavily than any criticism could have. I felt hundreds of eyes move away from Daniel and toward me. For the first time that evening, people were no longer watching a performance. They were looking at a person. Daniel glanced toward me, expecting me to smile and reassure everyone that everything was fine. I tried to smile, but I could not. My expression alone answered the stranger's question more honestly than any speech ever could. The master of ceremonies quietly stepped closer, unsure whether to end the exchange or let it continue. Nobody seemed eager to laugh anymore. Even the guests who had jokingly called out bids moments earlier now looked uncomfortable. The stranger handed the microphone back without adding another dramatic sentence. "Charity events remind us that every person has value," he said softly. "Let us not forget that while we are trying to raise money for a good cause." Then he returned to his table as calmly as he had left it. Daniel remained standing beneath the stage lights holding the microphone, but for the first time all evening he appeared unsure of what to say. The silence surrounding him felt louder than the laughter that had filled the room only minutes before, and as I watched his confident smile slowly disappear, I realized the evening had just changed in a way neither of us had expected. The master of ceremonies thanked the audience for their generosity and gently guided the evening back toward its original purpose, but the atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed in ways no carefully planned schedule could repair. Conversations resumed in quiet voices instead of cheerful laughter. The live band began playing another soft instrumental piece, yet even the music seemed unable to erase the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the room. Daniel Carter returned to our table carrying the same confident smile he had worn only minutes earlier, but it no longer reached his eyes. He sat beside me and whispered, "I cannot believe that man took a harmless joke so seriously." I looked down at the folded dinner napkin resting in my hands before answering. "He was not the one who took it seriously," I replied softly. "I did." Daniel stared at me as though hearing those words for the first time. "Emily, come on," he said quietly. Everyone knew I was kidding. I nodded without arguing because I understood exactly what he meant. The problem was that every person in the ballroom had known it was a joke except the one person who had been asked to become part of it. Across the room I noticed several guests glancing toward our table before quickly looking away again. A woman who had laughed moments earlier offered me a small, apologetic smile as she passed by. Another couple quietly thanked the event organizers and left earlier than planned. Nobody seemed angry. Instead, they appeared reflective, almost as though the stranger's question had forced them to reconsider not only what had happened on stage but the moments in their own lives when they had laughed simply because everyone else was laughing. Daniel tried to change the subject by asking whether I wanted dessert, but the conversation felt strangely distant now. I realized I could still hear his words, Yet my mind remained fixed on the moment when the ballroom had gone silent after the stranger asked whether anyone would laugh if the person being auctioned were their own daughter or mother. That question continued echoing inside me because it had exposed something far deeper than embarrassment. It had revealed how easily dignity could disappear when enough people decided to call humiliation entertainment. A few minutes later, the stranger walked past our table on his way toward the coffee station. As he approached, Daniel straightened in his chair as though preparing to defend himself, but the man simply nodded politely. "I hope your evening improves," he said with genuine kindness before continuing across the ballroom. There was no accusation in his voice. No satisfaction at having embarrassed anyone. His calmness somehow made the moment even more powerful. Daniel watched him walk away before quietly saying, "He made me look like the bad guy." I slowly turned toward my husband. "No," I answered. "He gave everyone a chance to see what was already happening." Daniel did not respond. Instead, he stared at the untouched dessert that had just been placed in front of us. For the first time since we arrived, he stopped searching the room for people who might still be laughing at his joke. Instead, he began noticing the people who were no longer smiling at all, and I could not help wondering whether that quiet realization would become the beginning of genuine understanding or merely another uncomfortable memory he would try to leave behind when the evening finally ended. When the charity program finally ended, guests gathered near the ballroom entrance exchanging quiet goodbyes instead of the cheerful conversations that usually followed an evening of celebration. Daniel Carter thanked several coworkers as though nothing unusual had happened, but I noticed more than one person offering him polite smiles without their earlier enthusiasm. Others approached me instead. A woman from a local nonprofit gently squeezed my hand and whispered, "I hope you are all right." She did not ask for an explanation because she had already seen enough. Her kindness almost brought tears to my eyes. Sometimes compassion hurts more than criticism because it reminds you that someone else recognized the pain you were trying so hard to hide. Daniel collected our coats and held the door open as we stepped into the cool evening air. The parking lot was quiet beneath rows of streetlights reflecting across the polished roofs of parked cars. We walked side by side without speaking. The silence between us felt unfamiliar because Daniel had always been the kind of person who filled every quiet moment with conversation. Tonight even he seemed unable to find the right words. As we reached our car, he unlocked the doors and finally sighed. "I still think everyone overreacted," he said while starting the engine. I fastened my seatbelt and stared through the windshield before answering. "Do you really believe that?" My question lingered between us longer than either of us expected. Daniel pulled out of the parking lot, keeping his eyes on the road. "I was trying to make people laugh," he replied. "Nobody actually believed I was selling my wife." I nodded slowly. "I know that." He glanced toward me briefly, almost relieved that I agreed. Then I quietly continued. But everyone believed they had permission to laugh while I sat there wishing the moment would end. The relief disappeared from his face. We drove several more blocks beneath the glow of traffic lights without another word. The city seemed unusually peaceful, yet inside the car every mile felt heavier than the one before it. Eventually Daniel lowered the radio volume until it was completely silent. "I never wanted to embarrass you," he admitted. "Intentions matter," I answered softly. "But so do outcomes." Neither of us spoke again until we reached home. Inside the house, Daniel placed the car keys on the kitchen counter and loosened his tie. I quietly removed my shoes and walked toward the living room, where the evening suddenly replayed itself in my mind with painful clarity. The laughter. The pretend bids. The stranger calmly asking whether anyone would laugh if it had been their own mother or daughter. Daniel followed me into the room. "Emily," he said carefully, "who was that man anyway?" I looked toward the window where the reflection of our living room stared back at us in the dark glass. "I do not know his name," I answered honestly. But tonight he was the only person who remembered that I was a human being before I was the subject of a joke. Daniel lowered his head. For the first time since the fundraiser began, he did not defend himself. He simply stood there in complete silence, and although no apology had yet been spoken, I sensed that something much more uncomfortable had finally begun. He was no longer arguing with a stranger. He had quietly started confronting the version of himself that had stepped onto that stage believing respect could survive humiliation disguised as humor. The next morning our home felt unusually quiet, yet the silence carried none of the comfort I had always associated with peace. Daniel Carter left for work earlier than usual, offering only a brief goodbye before closing the front door behind him. I stood in the kitchen holding a warm cup of coffee that had already begun to cool, replaying every moment from the charity fundraiser in my mind. I kept asking myself the same question. Why had one stranger recognized my pain so quickly while the man who promised to love me for the rest of his life never noticed it until someone else pointed it out? Around noon my phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but something encouraged me to answer. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Michael Brooks. He explained that one of the event organizers had shared my contact information only after asking whether I would be comfortable receiving a call. His tone remained respectful from the first sentence to the last. "I hope I am not interrupting your day," he said. "I simply wanted to make sure you were doing all right after last night." I thanked him for calling and admitted that I was still trying to understand everything that had happened. Michael remained quiet for a moment before saying something I would never forget. "Please do not allow yourself to believe the number they joked about last night represented your worth. $20 was never the issue. It could have been $1 or $1 million. The problem was never the amount. The problem was treating someone who deserves respect as though her dignity could become entertainment." His words settled into my heart with surprising gentleness. He was not trying to convince me to be angry with Daniel. He was reminding me that self-respect should never depend on another person's opinion. Before ending the call, Michael shared one final thought. "Healthy marriages survive mistakes," he said. "They struggle only when mistakes are defended instead of understood." After we said goodbye, I remained seated by the living room window thinking about that sentence. Late that afternoon Daniel returned home carrying a small paper bag from my favorite neighborhood bakery. Normally that thoughtful gesture would have made me smile immediately, but today it felt different because kindness could not erase what had happened without honesty accompanying it. Daniel placed the bag on the kitchen counter and looked at me carefully. "I have been thinking about last night all day," he admitted. I could barely concentrate at work. I listened without interrupting. Every time I remembered people laughing, I kept hearing that man's question asking whether anyone would laugh if it had been their own mother or daughter. He lowered his eyes before quietly adding, "For the first time I imagined someone standing on that stage talking about my mother the way I talked about you, and suddenly nothing about the joke felt funny anymore." I saw genuine regret beginning to replace wounded pride, but I also understood that recognition alone could not rebuild broken trust. Trust returns only after repeated choices prove that respect has become stronger than ego. Daniel stepped closer and asked softly, "Emily, if I truly understand what I did now, where do I even begin making it right?" I looked at him for a long moment because the answer would determine not only the future of our marriage but whether the lesson from one quiet stranger would become a lasting change or simply another apology forgotten with time. The following Saturday Daniel Carter asked whether I would be willing to return with him to the community center where the fundraiser had taken place. His request surprised me because the event had already ended, and there seemed to be no reason to revisit a place that held such painful memories. When I asked why, he answered with unusual honesty. "I think the apology I owe cannot exist only inside our living room," he said quietly. "The mistake happened in public. I believe my responsibility belongs there too." I studied his face for several moments before agreeing. We arrived just after noon, when volunteers were organizing supplies left over from the charity event. Several people immediately recognized us, though their expressions carried more curiosity than judgment. Daniel walked directly to the event coordinator and asked whether he could have a few minutes to speak before the volunteers began their afternoon meeting. She looked surprised but kindly agreed. As people gathered near the stage where everything had happened a week earlier, I stood quietly near the back of the room. Daniel stepped to the microphone, paused for a long moment, and took a slow breath. There was no trace of the confident entertainer who had once tried to fill the ballroom with laughter. Last weekend, he began, I believed I was telling a harmless joke. I convinced myself that because I never intended to hurt anyone, no real harm had been done. I was wrong. The room became completely silent. Daniel continued without rushing. I embarrassed the person who has supported me through every success and every failure in my life. I asked strangers to laugh at my wife instead of protecting her dignity. The fact that I called it humor does not change what she experienced. Several volunteers lowered their eyes. Others listened without moving. Nobody interrupted because his words carried no excuses. A gentleman I did not even know asked one simple question that changed the way I see my own actions. He reminded me that respect is measured by how we treat the people closest to us when everyone else is watching. I cannot undo what happened, but I can publicly acknowledge that I failed the woman who deserved my respect the most. He then turned toward me. Emily, I am deeply sorry. I cannot ask you to forget that evening, and I do not expect forgiveness simply because I apologized. I only promise that I will spend far more time rebuilding your trust than I ever spent trying to earn a laugh. Tears quietly filled my eyes, not because every wound had suddenly disappeared, but because this was the first time I saw humility replace pride without hesitation. As the room remained silent, gentle applause slowly began from the back. I turned and recognized Michael Brooks standing near the doorway. He had arrived quietly, just as he had on the night everything changed. He did not clap the loudest. He simply nodded once with a peaceful smile before preparing to leave again. Daniel noticed him and started walking in his direction, but Michael gently raised a hand. You do not owe me anything, he said warmly. The only opinion that truly matters is hers. He looked toward me for a brief moment before disappearing through the doorway. Watching him leave, I realized that some people enter our lives for only a few minutes, yet those few minutes can permanently change the direction of an entire marriage if someone is willing to learn from the truth they quietly bring. The weeks that followed did not feel dramatic, and perhaps that was the greatest evidence that real change had begun. Daniel Carter stopped believing that one emotional speech or one public apology could erase the memory of that evening. Instead, he quietly allowed his daily choices to speak where his words no longer carried enough weight. Every morning he woke before I did and prepared breakfast without announcing it as a grand gesture. Every evening he asked about my day before talking about his own. When we attended neighborhood gatherings or business dinners, he no longer searched for the quickest joke that would make everyone laugh. Instead, he paid attention to whether I felt included, respected, and comfortable. At first I appreciated the effort, but appreciation and trust are not the same thing. Trust grows slowly because it remembers every moment that once caused it to disappear. One afternoon we were invited to celebrate Daniel's father's retirement at a local restaurant. Nearly 30 family members filled a private dining room, and the atmosphere reminded me just enough of the charity fundraiser to make my stomach tighten. Daniel noticed my hesitation before we even entered the building. He quietly asked, "Would you rather leave?" I smiled gently and shook my head. "No," I answered. "I simply needed to know you would ask." During dinner, one of Daniel's cousins jokingly suggested that husbands should be allowed to trade household responsibilities by loaning out their wives for a weekend. Several people laughed politely, expecting Daniel to continue the joke the way he once would have. Instead, he smiled calmly and replied, "My wife is my partner, not my punchline." The room became quiet for only a second before the conversation naturally moved in another direction. Nobody argued. Nobody felt uncomfortable. Yet I felt something inside me become lighter than it had been in months. Daniel had protected my dignity without making a performance of it. He simply treated respect as something normal instead of something extraordinary. Later that evening, while helping his father carry gifts to the car, Daniel's older brother quietly pulled him aside. I overheard only part of their conversation, but one sentence reached me clearly. "You have changed," his brother said. Daniel answered without hesitation. I finally understood that making strangers laugh is never worth making the person you love feel small. On the drive home, I looked out the passenger window as the city lights reflected across the windshield. "Today felt different," I said softly. Daniel nodded while keeping his eyes on the road. "Because today I was thinking about you before I was thinking about everyone else." Those words stayed with me long after we arrived home because they reflected a lesson that could never be learned through embarrassment alone. It had been learned through humility, consistency, and the willingness to become a better husband after recognizing a painful truth. I realized forgiveness was no longer something waiting somewhere in the future. Quietly, almost without noticing, it had already begun taking root inside my heart, and for the first time since that unforgettable evening, I found myself believing that our marriage was no longer trying to return to what it had been before. It was slowly becoming something stronger than it had ever been. Nearly 6 months passed before I fully understood that healing is rarely announced by one unforgettable moment. More often it arrives quietly, disguised as ordinary days that no longer carry the same weight they once did. Daniel Carter and I had settled into new routines shaped less by grand promises and more by consistent respect. One autumn afternoon, we received an invitation to another charity gala hosted by the same organization. I held the envelope in my hands for several minutes without opening it. Daniel noticed immediately. "We do not have to go," he said. "Nobody would blame us." I looked at the invitation again before answering. "Maybe this time we should go for a different reason." On the evening of the event, we walked into the familiar ballroom together. The decorations were different, yet the polished floor, the warm lights, and the elegant tables brought back memories I had believed were safely behind me. Daniel quietly reached for my hand before anyone noticed us. He did not do it for appearances. He did it because he sensed what I was feeling without needing me to explain it. Several volunteers greeted us warmly, thanking us for returning. A few even mentioned that Daniel's public apology months earlier had inspired conversations within their own families about respect, kindness, and the power of words. Hearing that surprised both of us because neither of us had imagined that one difficult evening could encourage something meaningful for other people. As dinner began, the master of ceremonies welcomed everyone and briefly spoke about creating communities where generosity always included compassion. He never mentioned our names, yet I quietly understood that the lesson from the previous event had not been forgotten. Halfway through the evening, another guest stood to make a humorous announcement about donating an unusual item for the silent auction. The audience laughed politely, but this time the humor remained focused on the object itself rather than another person. Daniel leaned toward me and whispered with a gentle smile, "Amazing how easy it is to be funny without making someone else feel small." I smiled back because those words represented a version of my husband I had once hoped still existed beneath his pride. Later that evening, I noticed Michael Brooks speaking with several organizers near the entrance. After months, I finally had the opportunity to thank him properly. When I approached, he greeted me with the same calm kindness he had shown from the beginning. "You both look different," he observed warmly. I nodded. "We are different." He smiled but quickly corrected me. "No," he replied. "You were always the same. The difference is that now respect has become visible." Daniel joined us a moment later and thanked Michael once again for having the courage to speak when everyone else remained silent. Michael shook his head gently. "I only asked one question," he answered. "The real work happened afterward, when both of you decided to keep listening long after the room became quiet." As the evening came to an end, Daniel and I stepped outside beneath the cool autumn sky. We paused before walking to the car, neither of us rushing to leave. Months earlier we had left this place carrying embarrassment and regret. Tonight we left carrying something entirely different. We carried the quiet confidence that dignity, once protected every single day, becomes the strongest foundation any marriage can ever have. A full year later I found myself standing in the same community center, but this time the room felt completely different. Children laughed while volunteers arranged donation boxes, families greeted one another with genuine warmth, and the evening carried the quiet joy that had always been intended for this place. Daniel Carter stood beside me helping unload supplies from our car before anyone asked. Watching him greet every volunteer with humility instead of seeking attention reminded me just how far we had both traveled since that unforgettable night. During the opening remarks, the event coordinator invited several longtime supporters to share brief reflections about why community mattered. To my surprise, she called my name. My first instinct was to decline, but Daniel gently squeezed my hand and whispered, "Say only what feels true." I walked to the microphone, looking across the room filled with familiar and unfamiliar faces. Some had been there a year earlier. Others knew nothing about what had once happened in this very ballroom. I smiled softly before speaking. "There was a time when I believed one painful evening had permanently changed my marriage," I began. Looking back now, I realize it did. It simply changed it in a different direction than I expected. The room listened in complete silence. I learned that respect is not measured by the beautiful words people speak when life is easy. Respect is revealed in the choices people make when they have the opportunity to protect someone else's dignity. I also learned that sincere apologies are not proven by emotion. They are proven by consistent actions repeated day after day. I looked toward Daniel, who remained standing quietly among the volunteers instead of moving closer to the stage. That simple decision somehow reflected everything he had learned. He no longer needed to become the center of attention. He simply wanted to become the husband I had always believed he could be. As I stepped away from the microphone, I noticed Michael Brooks standing near the back of the room once again. Just as before, he had arrived without drawing attention to himself. Before the evening ended, I walked over to thank him one final time. He smiled warmly and said, "You never needed someone to rescue you. You only needed one moment that reminded everyone else what respect looks like." I thanked him for asking the question that changed our lives. He gently shook his head. "The question opened the door," he replied. "The two of you chose to walk through it." We watched families laughing together as volunteers carried donations toward waiting trucks outside. Daniel joined us a moment later, and for the first time all three of us stood together beneath the soft evening lights without needing to discuss the past anymore. Some stories end with revenge. Others end with dramatic victories. Ours ended with something far quieter and far more valuable. It ended with two people choosing every single day to honor each other in ways that no audience could applaud and no stranger could measure. As we walked toward our car hand in hand, I realized the greatest gift anyone had given me was never protection from humiliation. It was the reminder that true dignity can never be purchased, borrowed, or auctioned away because its real value has never depended on a number. It has always depended on the courage of those who refuse to forget that every human heart deserves respect, especially the one waiting beside them at home.